For almost 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs stood at the center of European power. They ruled Spain, controlled vast overseas territories, influenced the politics of Italy and the Netherlands, and married into the most important royal families on the continent. Yet in 1700, their dynasty disappeared from the Spanish throne with the death of Charles II, a king who left no legitimate heir. But did the Habsburg family truly vanish? The answer is more complicated than the traditional story suggests. While the direct Spanish male line ended with Charles II, Habsburg ancestry continued through daughters, marriages, illegitimate branches, and connections with other European dynasties. Over time, the family name became less visible, but its bloodline entered royal houses, aristocratic families, and branches that survived the collapse of Europe's old empires. In this documentary, we will follow what happened to the living descendants and related branches of the Spanish Habsburgs. We will separate documented genealogy from popular myths, examine how the dynasty's legacy passed into other families, and discover where members of these lines can be found today. If you enjoy historical investigations that go beyond the usual version of the past, subscribe to the channel and join us as we uncover what really happened to the descendants of Spain's last Habsburg rulers. 1. The Spanish Habsburgs, Europe's most powerful royal family. The Spanish Habsburgs emerged from a dynastic marriage that transformed European history. In 1496, Philip of Burgundy, the son of Emperor Maximilian I, married Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Their union connected the Habsburg family to the recently unified Spanish monarchy and created the foundation for a dynasty that would dominate Europe for generations. Their greatest rise came with their son Charles, who became King Charles I of Spain and later Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. By inheritance, Charles controlled Spain, the Netherlands, territories in Italy, Austria, and a growing overseas empire. No modern nation-state existed in the way we understand it today, so his power was not concentrated in one continuous country. Instead, it was held together through personal loyalty, dynastic inheritance, military force, and political negotiation. Charles V's empire gave the Habsburgs extraordinary influence, but it also created serious administrative problems. A monarch could not personally govern every territory, language group, and legal system under his authority. Charles therefore depended on councils, viceroys, governors, nobles, and royal officials. This reveals an important point. Habsburg power was not simply based on wealth or armies. It depended on a complex system of delegated authority. Spain became the central pillar of the dynasty's power after Charles divided his inheritance. In 1556, he abdicated and transferred the Spanish territories to his son Philip II, while the Austrian lands and imperial title passed to his brother Ferdinand. This separation created 2 major Habsburg branches, the Spanish line and the Austrian line. They remained politically connected, but they developed different priorities and faced different challenges. Under Philip II, Spain reached an impressive level of global influence. Madrid became the center of an empire that stretched across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and parts of Africa. Silver from the Americas helped finance armies and international commitments, although it would be misleading to assume that wealth automatically produced stability. Spain also carried enormous military expenses, inherited debts, and the cost of defending a far-reaching empire. The Habsburg monarchy also used marriage as a central instrument of foreign policy. Royal weddings created alliances, reduced the risk of war, and strengthened claims to disputed territories. However, the same strategy gradually narrowed the family's marriage choices. Because the Spanish monarchs preferred Catholic dynasties, they often married relatives from the Austrian Habsburg branch or other closely connected European houses. This pattern created a serious dynastic vulnerability. Successive generations inherited not only political claims, but also an increasingly concentrated ancestry. Modern studies suggest that consanguinity contributed to health problems within the royal line, although it should not be treated as the only explanation for the dynasty's decline. War, financial weakness, infant mortality, political rivalry, and succession laws were equally important parts of the story. The Spanish Habsburgs were therefore powerful, but their power contained a contradiction. The family expanded its influence by concentrating authority, territory, and inheritance within a limited circle. That strategy produced one of Europe's greatest imperial dynasties, but it also made the succession increasingly fragile. By the 17th century, the question was no longer whether the Habsburgs were powerful, but whether the Spanish branch could survive its own political and biological limitations. 2. Charles II and the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. Charles II was born in Madrid in 1661, the only surviving son of King Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. His birth was celebrated as a victory for the dynasty because Spain had already experienced the deaths of several heirs. Yet from the beginning, Charles's health appeared fragile, and his survival did not guarantee the future of the Spanish monarchy. He became king in 1665 when he was only 4 years old. Because of his age and poor health, his mother initially governed as regent. The court was divided among ministers, nobles, relatives, and foreign advisors, each attempting to influence the direction of the monarchy. This weakened the authority of the crown and made Charles's personal condition a matter of international concern. Charles suffered from numerous illnesses throughout his life. Later descriptions portrayed him in exaggerated and sometimes dehumanizing terms, creating the famous image of the bewitched king. Historians must treat these accounts carefully because many were written by political opponents or repeated long after his death. Even so, there is broad evidence that Charles experienced serious physical problems and struggled to produce an heir. His first marriage was to Marie Louise of Orleans, a French princess. The marriage was politically important because it temporarily improved relations between Spain and France. However, the couple had no children. Marie Louise died in 1689, and her death intensified fears that the Spanish Habsburg succession might soon end. Charles later married Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess believed to be capable of producing heirs. Despite efforts to secure the succession, the marriage also remained childless. The failure of both marriages turned the king's private life into a matter of European diplomacy. Foreign governments began planning for the division or inheritance of the Spanish monarchy before Charles had even died. The absence of an heir created two major claimants. Louis XIV of France supported his grandson Philip of Anjou, while Emperor Leopold I of the Austrian Habsburgs supported his son, Archduke Charles. Both claims were based on family connections, previous marriages, and competing interpretations of succession rights. Charles II died on November 1, 1700, without a legitimate child. His will named Philip of Anjou as successor, but this decision did not bring peace. Instead, it triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, because several European powers feared that Spain and France might become united under one Bourbon monarch. The death of Charles II ended the Spanish Habsburg dynasty as a ruling house, but it did not erase the family's wider ancestry. The political line had reached its conclusion, yet Habsburg blood had already passed through daughters, marriages, and related branches. Understanding this distinction is essential. The Spanish Habsburg monarchy disappeared in 1700, but the family's genealogical legacy continued in other European dynasties. 3. Why the dynasty failed to produce a successor. The Spanish Habsburg succession crisis was not caused by one isolated event. It developed over several generations through a combination of family marriages, child mortality, political pressure, and the limited number of eligible heirs. The dynasty depended on a small royal family to preserve control over an enormous monarchy, making every birth and death a matter of state security. Marriage within the European ruling class was common during this period, but the Spanish Habsburgs practiced it with unusual frequency among close relatives. Several kings married first cousins, nieces, or women descended from the same small group of royal ancestors. These unions were intended to preserve territory, religion, and political influence, but they also increased the concentration of inherited traits. Philip II, for example, married 4 times, including a marriage to his niece Anna of Austria. Philip IV later married Mariana of Austria, who was also his niece. These alliances were not chosen simply for personal reasons. They reflected the political priorities of the dynasty, which valued Catholic unity and the protection of Habsburg interests above genetic diversity. At the same time, royal families in early modern Europe faced extremely high rates of infant and childhood mortality. Medical knowledge was limited, infections were common, and childbirth was dangerous for both mothers and children. The Spanish royal family experienced repeated miscarriages, stillbirths, and the early deaths of potential heirs, leaving the succession far more vulnerable than official ceremonies suggested. The health of individual heirs also played a decisive role. Prince Balthazar Charles, the son of Philip IV, was expected to secure the future of the monarchy, but he died at the age of 16. His death forced Philip IV to remarry and eventually produced Charles II, whose own health problems made the succession uncertain from childhood. Modern genetic research has suggested that accumulated inbreeding may have contributed to Charles II's physical condition and infertility. However, this conclusion should be presented carefully. Genetics can help explain certain vulnerabilities, but it cannot fully reconstruct the life of a historical individual from portraits and court descriptions alone. Political structure made the problem even more serious. The Spanish monarchy did not have a simple modern succession system that could easily accept a distant relative. Claims depended on legitimacy, gender, treaties, religious identity, and the rights of competing dynasties. As a result, the absence of a direct heir immediately opened the door to international conflict. The failure of the Spanish Habsburgs was therefore a dynastic crisis, rather than a simple story of personal weakness. Their policies had successfully protected power for generations, but those same policies reduced the number of possible heirs and intensified biological and political risks. When Charles II died childless, the dynasty's carefully constructed system had no secure successor to maintain it. 4. The Bourbon takeover and the War of the Spanish Succession. When Charles II died in 1700, his will named Philip of Anjou as the next King of Spain. Philip was the grandson of Louis the Trinket of France, and was therefore connected to the Spanish Habsburgs through his grandmother, Maria Theresa, the daughter of Philip IV. The decision transferred the Spanish throne to the Bourbon family, but it immediately alarmed other European powers. The main concern was that France and Spain might become politically united under the same royal dynasty. Such an arrangement could create an overwhelming power bloc in Europe, especially because Spain still controlled important territories in Italy, the Netherlands, and the Americas. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and several German states opposed the possibility of a Bourbon superpower. The Austrian Habsburgs supported Archduke Charles, the younger son of Emperor Leopold I. Charles also had a claim through his family connection to the Spanish monarchy. In the eyes of the Austrian court, the Habsburg inheritance should remain within the wider Habsburg family rather than pass to the French Bourbons. The dispute became the War of the Spanish Succession, which began in 1701. It was not simply a Spanish civil conflict or a family argument. It was a major European war involving questions of balance of power, territorial control, commercial access, and the future political order of the continent. Philip of Anjou entered Spain and was recognized by many Spanish subjects as King Philip V. However, other regions, especially in the Crown of Aragon, resisted Bourbon centralization and supported the Austrian candidate. These divisions reflected not only loyalty to rival dynasties, but also local concerns about laws, privileges, and the future structure of the Spanish monarchy. The war continued for more than a decade and spread across Europe and overseas territories. Battles were fought in Spain, Italy, the Low Countries, and parts of Germany. The conflict demonstrated that the Spanish succession was connected to the entire European system, and that the end of one dynasty could reshape international politics. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 confirmed Philip V as King of Spain, but with an important condition. The Spanish and French crowns could not be united. Spain also surrendered several European possessions, including territories in Italy and the Netherlands. The Bourbon dynasty remained in Spain, while the old Habsburg political order was permanently broken. The Bourbon takeover marked the end of Habsburg rule in Madrid, but it did not mean that every Habsburg connection disappeared. The new royal family inherited territories, institutions, archives, and traditions from the previous dynasty. In this sense, the Habsburgs lost the throne, but their influence continued through the political and family structures they had built over nearly 2 centuries. 5. Did the Habsburg bloodline really disappear? The death of Charles II ended the direct Spanish Habsburg line that ruled Spain from 1516 to 1700. Because he had no legitimate children, there was no surviving son or daughter who could continue the dynasty in the traditional sense. Politically, the Spanish Habsburgs had disappeared from the throne. However, a dynasty can end as a ruling institution without disappearing from genealogy. The Habsburg kings were connected to many European families through marriage, and several of their daughters became queens, duchesses, or princesses in other courts. Their descendants carried parts of the family ancestry into new dynasties. This distinction is often overlooked in popular videos. When people ask whether the Spanish Habsburgs are still alive, they may be referring to 3 different things: descendants of the Spanish kings, members of the Austrian Habsburg family, or people who simply possess Habsburg ancestry somewhere in their family tree. These categories should not be treated as identical. The Spanish Habsburg kings also had illegitimate children, although those lines generally did not possess the same succession rights as legitimate royal descendants. Some illegitimate branches became connected to the nobility, military institutions, religious communities, and administrative elites of Europe. Their history is less visible because official dynastic records focused mainly on legitimate heirs. The wider Habsburg family survived through the Austrian branch, which later became the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. This branch produced emperors, archdukes, queens, and princesses well into the 19th and 20th centuries. Although these individuals were not members of the Spanish ruling line in a strict sense, they belonged to the same broader dynastic family. Through repeated marriages, Habsburg ancestry also entered the Bourbon, Savoy, Wittelsbach, Braganza, and other European royal houses. Over several centuries, these families became so interconnected that many modern royals share ancestors from the same small group of medieval and early modern monarchs. Yet genealogical survival does not mean that the family preserved its former power. After the fall of the Spanish and Austrian empires, descendants lost political privileges, imperial possessions, and official authority. Many continued to use noble titles socially, while others adopted ordinary surnames and lived outside public attention. The Habsburg bloodline therefore survived in a fragmented and transformed form. The Spanish branch ended as a monarchy, but its ancestry continued through other families and lines. The real story is not about a hidden Habsburg kingdom surviving in secret, but about how dynastic bloodlines gradually merged into the wider history of Europe. 6. Female descendants and the hidden continuation of the family. The survival of Habsburg ancestry after 1700 depended heavily on female descendants. In traditional dynastic histories, attention often focuses on kings, princes, and male heirs. However, royal daughters were essential in transferring family connections into other courts through marriage. One important example was Maria Theresa of Spain, the daughter of Philip IV and sister of Charles II. She married Louis XIV of France and became the mother of Charles II, King of Spain's future rival, the French Prince Louis Grand Dauphin. Although Maria Theresa renounced her own succession rights when she married, her descendants remained connected to the Spanish Habsburg family. Through this marriage, Habsburg ancestry entered the Bourbon dynasty of France. Louis, the Grand Dauphin, became the father of Philip of Anjou, who eventually inherited the Spanish throne as Philip VI. This means that the first Bourbon king of Spain was not unrelated to the previous dynasty. He descended from the Spanish Habsburgs through the female line. Other Habsburg princesses married into the royal families of Portugal, Bavaria, Savoy, and Austria. These marriages were designed to create alliances, but they also created genealogical bridges between dynasties. Over time, descendants of these women spread across the major aristocratic houses of Europe. The importance of female descent also exposes a limitation in traditional ideas about dynastic extinction. A family may end in the male line while continuing through daughters and granddaughters. If historians look only at surnames and titles, they may incorrectly conclude that the entire family vanished. However, tracing these lines requires precision. Not every descendant of a Habsburg princess can accurately be called a Spanish Habsburg. In many cases, the descendant belonged officially to another dynasty, carried a different surname, and had only one Habsburg ancestor among hundreds of relatives. This is why modern genealogical claims must be supported by documented family trees rather than vague statements. Royal archives, marriage records, birth registers, and scholarly genealogies help establish whether a modern person descends from a specific Habsburg line or merely shares a distant connection with the dynasty. The female descendants transformed the meaning of Habsburg survival. They did not restore the Spanish monarchy, but they ensured that the family's ancestry continued through new royal houses. Their marriages helped turn the Habsburg legacy from a political institution into a wide and interconnected genealogical network. 7. The difference between Spanish Habsburgs and Austrian Habsburgs. The name Habsburg refers to a large dynasty with several branches, not to one single uninterrupted royal family. The Spanish and Austrian branches came from the same house, but they became politically distinct after Charles V divided his territories in the 16th century. Understanding this separation is essential when discussing modern descendants. The Spanish branch ruled the Spanish monarchy from 1516 until the death of Charles II in 1700. Its kings included Charles I, Philip II, Philip III, Philip IV, and Charles II. Their authority was centered in Madrid, and their empire was strongly connected to Spain, the Americas, the Netherlands, Italy, and Portugal during the period of union. The Austrian branch developed around the Habsburg territories in Central Europe. It ruled Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and other lands, while also providing many Holy Roman emperors. After 1780, the family was generally known as Habsburg-Lorraine because of the marriage between Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis Stephen of Lorraine. The two branches continued to marry one another, which made their genealogies closely connected. Spanish monarchs often chose Austrian Habsburg relatives as spouses because both branches shared Catholic traditions and political interests. These marriages strengthened alliances, but also increased the level of family interconnection. Despite their common ancestry, the two branches did not always agree politically. The Austrian Habsburgs competed with France for influence in Europe, while the Spanish branch faced military pressure, financial difficulties, and the challenge of governing a global empire. Their cooperation was often valuable, but it was never completely free of rivalry. The death of Charles II ended the Spanish branch as the ruling dynasty of Spain. It did not end the Austrian branch, which continued for more than 2 centuries. Members of the Austrian family later ruled the Austrian Empire and Austria-Hungary, making the name Habsburg visible in European politics long after the Spanish succession changed. This distinction is frequently lost in popular accounts. When a modern individual is described as a Habsburg descendant, that person may descend from the Austrian Habsburgs, the Habsburg-Lorraine family, a Spanish princess, or a later marriage between several royal houses. These connections are historically meaningful, but they do not all represent the same line. The Austrian branch also produced descendants who married outside the immediate imperial family. Some entered the royal houses of Belgium, Italy, Bavaria, Saxony, Portugal, and Spain. Others became members of the European aristocracy, while some abandoned formal titles after political revolutions and republican reforms. The collapse of Austria-Hungary in 1918 changed the family's public status. Many Habsburgs lost official privileges, property, or political roles. Several relocated to Spain, Switzerland, Portugal, Germany, Italy, the United States, and Latin America. Their lives illustrate how former imperial families adapted to a world in which monarchy was no longer the center of political authority. Today, the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs should therefore be discussed as related but separate historical branches. The Spanish line ended on the throne with Charles II, while the broader Habsburg-Lorraine family survived through numerous descendants. Their shared ancestry explains the continuing presence of Habsburg connections, but careful genealogy is necessary to identify which branch each person actually belongs to. 8. What happened to the family after the fall of the empires? The decline of the Habsburgs did not happen at one single moment. The Spanish branch lost the throne in 1700, but the Austrian branch continued to rule for more than 2 centuries. The final political collapse came after the First World War, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire broke apart and the family lost its imperial authority. In 1918, Emperor Charles I renounced participation in the government of Austria, although he did not formally abdicate. Soon afterward, Austria became a republic, and the new government moved to remove the Habsburgs from political life. Members of the family were required to renounce claims to the throne or leave the country. The end of the empire also created a financial crisis for the family. Palaces, estates, collections, and other properties were seized or placed under state control. The Habsburgs had once depended on imperial institutions, court appointments, and inherited wealth, but those structures disappeared almost overnight. Several family members went into exile. Some settled in Switzerland, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Germany, or the United States. Their lives varied considerably. A few remained involved in public affairs, while others became scholars, business people, diplomats, artists, or private citizens far removed from royal politics. The exile of the Habsburgs also changed the meaning of their titles. Before 1918, titles such as Archduke, Archduchess, Prince, and Princess carried legal and social importance within the empire. After the fall of the monarchy, those titles often became matters of family tradition rather than official political status. Spain became an important place of refuge for several members of the wider Habsburg family. The country had historical connections to the dynasty, and some Habsburg relatives had already lived there through marriage or exile. However, residence in Spain did not mean that these individuals had any claim to the Spanish throne. Other branches moved farther away from Europe. Some relatives established lives in Latin America, including Brazil and Argentina, while others moved to North America. In these new environments, family members often adapted their names, careers, and lifestyles to republican societies. The dispersion of the family made it increasingly difficult to speak of one unified Habsburg household. Instead, the dynasty became a network of separate branches connected by ancestry, marriage, and shared history. Some relatives maintained detailed genealogical traditions, while others gradually became indistinguishable from the societies around them. This transformation also affected public perception. The Habsburgs became less a political force and more a symbol of Europe's vanished imperial world. Their former residences became museums, their archives became sources for historians, and their family stories were reinterpreted through documentaries, biographies, and genealogical studies. By the 20th century, the Habsburg legacy had therefore moved from government to memory. The family no longer commanded armies or governed a multinational empire, but its members continued to live across Europe and beyond. Their survival depended not on restoring a throne, but on adapting to a modern world that had largely rejected hereditary imperial rule. 9. Where related Habsburg descendants live today. Today, descendants of the wider Habsburg family live in several countries, especially across Europe. Many are connected to the Habsburg-Lorraine branches that survived after the fall of Austria-Hungary, while others descend from Habsburg princesses who married into different royal houses. Their lives are generally private and should not be confused with the existence of a restored imperial court. Austria remains one of the most important countries associated with the family. Vienna was the political center of the Habsburg monarchy, and several members of the family continue to maintain cultural, charitable, academic, or public connections there. However, modern Austria is a republic, and Habsburg descendants do not possess official ruling authority. Some members of the family have also lived in Germany and Switzerland. These countries became attractive locations for former imperial families because of their geographical proximity to Austria and their established aristocratic networks. In many cases, relatives pursued professional careers outside politics and avoided public attention. Spain also remains relevant because of its historical connection to the dynasty. Some descendants of Habsburg-related branches have lived in Spain through family ties, marriages, or exile. Nevertheless, the modern Spanish monarchy belongs to the House of Bourbon. not to the direct Spanish Habsburg line that ended with Charles II. Other branches are connected to Italy through the former ruling families of Tuscany, Modena, and other Italian states. Several Habsburg-Lorraine relatives married into Italian aristocratic families, and some descendants continued to live in Italy after the abolition of the country's monarchies. Portugal and Belgium also appear in the wider genealogical network. Royal marriages connected Habsburg descendants with the Braganza and Belgian royal families. These relationships demonstrate how European dynasties became closely related, but they do not mean that every member of those monarchies should be described as a direct Spanish Habsburg descendant. Some family branches moved beyond Europe during the 20th century. Relatives established lives in the United States, Canada, Brazil, and other countries. In these places, they often worked in business, education, diplomacy, the arts, or charitable organizations rather than maintaining formal aristocratic roles. The Habsburg name itself is not always preserved in every branch. Female descendants frequently adopted the surnames of their husbands, and some families used altered or simplified titles after Republican governments abolished hereditary privileges. As a result, a genealogical connection may be historically documented even when the Habsburg surname is no longer present. It is also important to distinguish documented descendants from online claims. The popularity of royal genealogy has encouraged many exaggerated family trees and unsupported statements. A reliable connection should be confirmed through birth records, marriage documents, archival material, or recognized genealogical research. The descendants of the Habsburgs therefore do not live in one hidden location. They are dispersed across several countries and social environments, with some remaining connected to noble traditions and others living ordinary private lives. Their modern story is less about power and more about adaptation, identity, and the gradual transformation of Europe's former ruling families. 10. From imperial rulers to private citizens, the modern Habsburg legacy. The descendants of the Habsburgs live in a world completely different from the one their ancestors ruled. Their family once controlled kingdoms, military alliances, colonial territories, and imperial institutions. Today, most descendants have no constitutional authority and participate in society as private citizens. Some members of the wider family remain involved in cultural and charitable activities. They may support historical preservation, religious institutions, educational projects, or organizations connected to European heritage. Their influence is symbolic rather than governmental. Others have pursued ordinary professional careers. Former imperial families have included lawyers, academics, business people, journalists, artists, diplomats, and public servants. These careers demonstrate how aristocratic descendants adapted when inherited privilege no longer guaranteed political power. The Habsburg name also survives through historical institutions. Palaces such as Schönbrunn and the Hofburg attract millions of visitors, while archives and museums preserve documents, portraits, furniture, and ceremonial objects connected to the dynasty. In many ways, the family's most visible legacy now belongs to the public. The Spanish connection remains especially complicated. The direct line of Spanish Habsburg kings ended with Charles II, but their ancestry continued through women and marriages into other dynasties. Therefore, modern descendants may possess Spanish Habsburg ancestry without belonging to a separate Spanish Habsburg family living as a political unit. This distinction is important because modern genealogy often turns complex family trees into simple labels. A person may descend from an Austrian Habsburg, a Bourbon princess, or a Habsburg-connected noble family. These relationships are historically legitimate, but each one represents a different branch and degree of connection. The family's past also raises ethical questions about how history should be presented. Charles II's health is frequently used as entertainment, but a responsible documentary should avoid mocking his appearance or reducing his life to medical speculation. The king was a historical individual who lived within a system of dynastic pressure, limited medicine, and intense political manipulation. The Habsburg story also teaches us that dynasties are not permanent institutions. Their power depended on inheritance, military resources, administrative systems, and public acceptance. Once those foundations collapsed, even one of Europe's most famous families had to adapt to ordinary political and social realities. Their survival was therefore not a return to imperial power. It was a process of transformation. Members of the family lost crowns but gained new identities, professions, countries, and forms of public participation. The dynasty continued through memory, genealogy, and culture rather than through government. The living descendants of the Spanish Habsburgs are best understood as part of a broad European family network. Some can be traced through documented royal lines, while others remain private and distant from public records. What survived was not an empire, but a complex human legacy that continues to connect the history of Spain with the wider history of Europe. Documentary conclusion. The Spanish Habsburgs disappeared from the Spanish throne in 1700, but their ancestry did not vanish completely. Through daughters, marriages, related branches, and later dynasties, elements of their family line continued into the modern age. Their descendants are not ruling Spain today, and there is no hidden Habsburg government waiting to reclaim the monarchy. Most live as private citizens, professionals, members of noble families, or participants in cultural and charitable institutions. The true legacy of the Spanish Habsburgs is therefore more complicated than the story of a dynasty that simply ended. They lost their empire, but their family connections survived across generations. If you enjoyed this historical investigation, subscribe to the channel for more documentaries about the hidden lives and legacies of Europe's former royal families.